the creation of Israel pissed off a lot of people, obviously, and you know, I'm not trying to like make this like a one-sided story, because I do think that there's like there's obviously been atrocities committed on both sides, and all of that's bad. But I just like a lot of, you know, like you can go on YouTube and you can find like Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager and all these guys. They have like these videos. It'll be like, you know, The Brief History of Israel by Ben Shapiro.
Yeah,
it's like, well, the Jews wanted to start a free country, and then the Arabs attacked them. Like, I'm not even like exaggerating. That's like the story of their history. And it's like, well, I mean, there was a middle part there, you know, that you kind of left out.
And I understand the need for a Jewish nation when they historically get persecuted, slaughtered, whatever. I just feel like, you know, maybe you just give them the Dakotas. You know what I mean? Like, we got some states we're not really using.
Have you heard a good foreign policy solution for the region? Like that protects Israel from getting ran over by Iran or any other aggressor?
Yeah, I mean, like
but also preserves, you know,
so at every point, at every point that there were like meaningful negotiations, it was always basically predicated on the fact that 67 borders, and what they mean when they say 67 borders are basically the way it happened was as you know, as you know, the Zionist settlers before Israel was created started moving to what was known as Palestine then, and they were trying to get more and more people to move there. At first, they had a lot of trouble getting, most Jews who were like in London or New York or wherever were like, I'm an accountant and things are okay, and I don't really feel like going to be a poor farmer in Palestine. Like, what is this project? After World War II and after the Nazis were defeated, it really picked up steam, and a lot of people wanted to move. There was a lot of it's a really interesting history.
They discovered Sephardics.
Well, that also happened like a little bit later as the Sephardic Jews all came. They were kicked out of neighboring Arab countries, but so basically they had been working on creating a Jewish homeland there for decades. And in 47, when the British basically got out of there because the Jews had become terrorists and basically drove them out of Palestine, they kicked it over to the United Nations, which was brand new. And the United Nations was like, well, why don't we divide up the land? Like they made a recommendation. It wasn't like the General Assembly had no authority to just like carve up countries, but they were like, this is what we recommend. And they recommended that the Jews get 56% of the land and the Arabs get 44% of the land. And that was really not based on anything. I think Jews owned like 10% of the land at the time or something like that. The Arabs were like, no, this is ridiculous. Like, this has been our home for hundreds of years, thousands of years. Like, no, we're not giving them the majority. And then a civil war broke out, and about 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out and never allowed back in. And those are the people who are in Gaza and the West Bank to this day, or the children and grandchildren of them. Some of them are in Jordan and Lebanon and stuff. And so like this, and then the neighboring Arab countries attacked. They fought a war. They fought a war again in the 50s. They fought a war again in the 60s. They fought a war again in the 70s. I mean, it was like there were major problems that came along. And it's a very rich history with a lot of, you know, this side's story or this side's story, but you could at least grant that, unlike what Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager say in their videos, no, there is a Palestinian side to this story where like a lot of those people were genuinely wronged. And yes, there were some Palestinians who embraced terrorism pretty early on. It was a very bad strategy for them, has not worked out well for their people, and also is just horrible and wrong. But the America ultimately coming into this, which the U.S. was not at first, but ultimately deciding that we will be unconditionally on one side of this conflict, I think was not smart or fair or wise.
And how did that happen? Was that AIPAC even back then, or do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. You know, there was a lot of interesting stuff kind of behind the scenes. I don't know exactly. I know that there were there was definitely some blackmail stuff going on. The Ben Gurion was definitely at least attempting to blackmail Allen Dulles for a while. This was in the 60s, who's the head of the CIA here.
Dulles Airport, right?
I believe the airport is named after his brother. But check on that. His brother was Secretary of State, I believe. I think they wouldn't name the airport after the CIA director. That would just be too in our face.
Yeah.
Like, what? You get an airport?
Yeah.
But whatever. I mean, they worked pretty closely together. Yeah, tell me, who's the airport named after?
John
Dulles. Yeah, he was the Secretary of State, I believe.
Allen
right?
Dulles was the
Allen was CIA.
CIA guy.
But I don't know exactly, like, I'd have to brush up on, like, when exactly AIPAC was created and how much, when they gained all their influence. But one way or the other, they ended up getting American support, and I don't think that's been good for anyone involved, including Israel. So there's a weird thing, like, it's kind of like being on welfare isn't good for you, if you're able-bodied and you can work. And it's kind of like there's this moral hazard that comes along with being, dependent on someone in perpetuity, but you don't learn to be your own. The actual healthy thing would be like, hey, if you're going to create a nation here, then you gotta
know the repercussions of your actions.
Yeah, you got to work out your own balance.
There's no repercussions when you're, hanging with the boys.
And also, and this is one of the major problems in Ukraine too, is that when the biggest, baddest country in the history of the world, the United States of America, goes, we got your back, you end up getting a lot ballsier than you otherwise would be. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to go start a fight because my big brother will come bail me out. And it's like, no, you should actually only start a fight that you actually think you could win.
What do you think the resolution of that will be? Russia-Ukraine.
Oh, I mean, I think it's ultimately going to be essentially what the peace deal that was on the table at the very beginning that they made them squash, which is that Russia's going to keep parts of it.
Russia keeps parts of it. NATO doesn't get in. Military-industrial complex makes billions of dollars. Everybody's happy.
So where we started.
Everybody except the Ukrainians.
Well, everybody's happy except the Ukrainians. But what's interesting is if they accept the deal, then the military-industrial complex doesn't make billions of dollars. So we got to stretch this out. So that they can cash in a little bit. It's interesting to look at. What's that?
No, can you ask on the Israel side, like what's the? There's no solutions. I always say it's trade-offs. What's the short term and the medium term that you could think would be?
Well, so I'll do
what's going to be
long term first. Almost is what I would do. Which is, again, it's like this similar thing with Ukraine. It's like what's frustrating about all of this is that it's kind of like, I'm not saying like every precise detail is known, but the broad strokes is obviously there. So look, the UN recommends 56% for the state of Israel. Okay, then they go to war. Israel wins the war, and they don't just take that 56%. They take 78% of the land. Okay, then in 1967 they go to war with Egypt and Jordan. They win again, and then they take 100% of the land. So the last 22% is really what we're talking about, which is Gaza and the West Bank. Every single peace deal that's ever been on the table, and I'm not saying what the craziest leader of Hamas yells on social media or something.
You're talking about
when they actually sat down in the Oslo Accords, at Camp David, at any of this, it was always about that last 22%, which that's what they mean when they say 67 borders, is they're like, okay, you get the 78%.
Oh, really?
Not the 56% that you were supposed to have in the beginning that we didn't even think was fair back then. Not the 78% that you get that, but give us our last 22%. That's the deal.
But on that, just going back to you saying they went to war, when you go 67, when you go 73, when there is a war that happens, it's like, why do we get to go back to negotiating table after Israel won and say, all right, well, sorry about that, let's go back to this negotiating table.
I understand that perspective, like yesterday's price is not today's price, 100%, but I think like according to international law, you cannot take more land due to war or conflict. I think that's what
there's a lot of international laws. You're also not allowed to like do
but I also get that sentiment. Like we're occupying this land, you keep attacking us. All right, well then it's going to be ours. I get that feeling.
Okay, fine.
Sorry, can you tell us the laws though that?
Well, okay, so there is it is. I'm not an expert on international law, but the settlements are definitely illegal. You're not allowed to transfer your population into occupied territory, which they continue to do in the West Bank. And yes, I do do think that Andrew's right that like you're not really allowed to seize land from a war. I mean, this idea is like this is the old order. The whole reason why we have international law is that you can't just go win a war and then say your land is ours. But the problem beyond that is that it's not like Israel conquered Gaza and made it part of Israel, or conquered the West Bank and made it part of Israel. They're just conquering it and holding the people there forever. Right. Like and this is just, it's an unsustainable system. And nobody, I shouldn't say nobody, but I'm not saying, and whenever any of these real negotiations were happening, it's not the claim is like you all have to go back to Europe or you all have to go live somewhere else. That's obviously a non-starter. All this from the river to the sea stuff is not helpful at all. But I do think the obvious thing is that look, you got 5 million Palestinians living in this land. They have to get to have something. And it shouldn't be Israel's decision even. Like, why do you decide whether they get to have their own government or they get to, it's like they should have their
Let's say that there is a agreement reached, right? And it's they get the 22%. It's back to whatever, what was 67 borders or? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. 67 borders, whatever that is. How does Israel protect itself from another version of Hamas coming in and saying, hey, you know what, we don't want those. We don't want that agreement. Actually, we want 46%. Actually, we want 55%. Yeah, we want river to the sea. What are they supposed to do if they just relinquish total power in a vacuum? What would happen?
So this is I always love this quote, which I think I always butcher, but there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson where he's talking about slavery. And he said, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither afford to hold on to it nor to safely let it go. And essentially what the big concern is like, okay, these abolitionists are saying slavery is wrong, but I mean, if we just release these slaves, they're going to come kill us. We've been enslaving these people forever. We've done horrible things to them. Like, if we let them go now, they're going to all come kill us. And you can understand where, that was a concern at the time. And it's, somewhat reasonable one. But in hindsight, if you look at it with the moral clarity from 2000,
you should have done it.
You can't enslave people. I don't know. That's just not an option. So you just can't. So if that were to happen,
you're saying they have to assume the risk.
Well, yes, I'm saying that if Israel were to give Palestinian independence and then the Palestinians attacked Israel, we'd be having a different conversation at that point. But the fear of that is not enough to justify keeping people.
And what would that conversation be, do you think?
Well, I mean, look, the other thing about this I'll just say is that there's a lot of reason to think that wouldn't be the case. And that, look, when there were peace negotiations going on, there was a lot of support behind the Palestinian Authority. And when the peace negotiations collapsed, Hamas's support went through the roof. And it's almost like the more desperate people are, the more they're like, oh, let's go blow something up. Yeah. Whereas if they think there's actually hope and there's actually a chance for prosperity and a better life, they're much more likely to not engage in that. Now, I'm not saying that's a guarantee. If I were Israel, I wouldn't disarm tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Right.
Israel's got a pretty badass military. It is still hard to believe that they allowed October 7th to happen in the way they did. I'm not speculating about anything. I don't really have any solid evidence on any of that, but it's if you know anything about Israel and how much of a fortress it is and how prepared they are, it's the wait time just makes no sense. It's a tiny country. But they could pretty easily just not let that happen again and have solid border security. But that would be, I think ultimately that has
to be easy to
border
engender
security
US
was
support.
Besides that, and I won't even speak on the West Bank side. That's a complicated thing, and the hard right has always said if there was a two-state, it's Gaza. It's not also the West Bank, but you have Gaza. Thousands of rockets for years. So what's the border security? Do you believe that had there been just real peace, at least from Gaza, over years and years and years, the way that, they took away all the permits for all the workers that would come daily, do you believe that Israel would try to be, quote unquote, enslaving them? Or do you think, hey, build it up, let the money come in properly, not go into Hamas's, the kids, the billions of dollars? I truly believe the same way we made a deal with the Abraham Accords, and within 1 year, 1 million Israelis went to the Emirates. Like, they were dying to create business, to spend their money. Like, I truly believe that if just not West Bank, I'm talking Gaza, if there was peace, there would have been that exact same sentiment. And I think that that's what Israelis are like.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's kind of, look, I mean, Israel wasn't occupying, or if you don't like the word occupying, wasn't dominating any of those countries. And so the idea that you're going to, like, I mean, first of all, just the point you made about the money not going right into Hamas's coffers, to be clear, Israel won't let sugar or potatoes or all types of humanitarian aid into Gaza, but they would facilitate cash payments to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars directly to Hamas, because actually was the big secret, that Benjamin Netanyahu was intentionally keeping Hamas in power in Gaza. But I don't think the standard can be, we're going to dominate you and keep you in grinding poverty, and then with impunity, whenever we want to, go on these like bombing campaigns. I'm talking pre-October 7th, like this has just been the status quo in Gaza. And you got to stop firing your rockets back at us. And as soon as you start acting peaceful, then we will tell you that we will allow you.
Which order did that happen in? If Brooklyn is firing rockets into Manhattan for years and years, like, they're going to respond. I don't think that there were bombing campaigns without.
But now we're getting into chicken and the egg.
For sure. But
and in order to do that, we have to go back to 1920.
But we keep going back, and I'm like, what's the next?
Well, listen, I grant you that it's hard to say when you go with each one of these things, you go, well, which was a response to which, right? But if I'm just being honest here, you go, this was a response to that, which was a response to that, which was a response to that, which was a response to a bunch of Eastern Europeans moving to a land they didn't inhabit and kicking hundreds of thousands of the people there out. Like, that's really what the first thing that this is a response to. And it's just kind of hard to get away from that. Now, again, I'm not saying that means Jews are going away anytime soon. It's just like, look, the Native Americans, like, that problem here, right, is like solved pretty much. But if we were talking back about, like,
the old fashioned.
Yes, yeah, sure. But I'm just saying, if we went back to, like, well, look, were there instances where Native Americans attacked, you know what I mean, like settlers, and then they were responding? Right. Sure, but what was the first thing? The first thing was us coming over here.
For sure.
And so now, if to the degree that there are still Native Americans around,
you could make the argument that there were always Jews there. Even though these Eastern European Jews came, there were Jews that were Sephardic
there was always a small population. Yeah, and part of the reason why...
and there were no Americans here when the natives were here. That's why I think it's a little different.
Yeah, fair enough. But look, the Jews there also did, pre-Zionism, live in relative harmony with the Arabs. I mean, it's one of the reasons...
I've heard back and forths on this. I've heard, like, and I know everybody uses their own arguments, but, like, there's going to be a skirmish. Does that skirmish, and maybe that's too reductive, define the entirety of the relationship? If there's 100 years of peace and then this horrible thing happens, does that mean it was horrible the whole time? I don't know. But I've heard both arguments.
The early Zionists even said it was part of the reason why they wanted to make their homeland in Palestine.
Because it was so welcoming.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd say so welcoming, but relatively speaking, the Ottomans and the Arabs had been better friends to the Jews than the Europeans had been. That was really where they dealt with the brunt of their oppression.
So maybe the argument shouldn't be that they had this, like, amazing relationship. Maybe the argument is it's better than them white people were treating us.
Basically, everything is compared to what?
Yes, that's better. I think that's more digestible, because I've been kind of told there's this I've been told, and maybe it's propaganda, that, like, I've probably even regurgitated it, during the Ottoman Empire, the Jews flourished with the Ottomans, and they were best friends. I'm like, it must have been harmony.
See, I was saying pre-Zionism, because during the Ottoman Empire also this is kind of, I mean, it depends on what point during the Ottoman Empire you're talking about.
I mean, there's
because I think it's like 400 years or something.
Period, yeah.
So it's more like the problems, at least from my understanding of this, the problems got worse and worse as kind of like the Zionist experiment got more and more aggressive. And there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. There's one figure in Zionism who I find is my favorite, was Chaim Weizmann, who was like, did you know who that is? So he was like kind of the godfather of Zionism for a little bit there.
Before
like,
Herzl?
No, after Herzl, but like before Ben Gurion, so he was almost supposed to be David Ben Gurion, who ultimately became the first prime minister of, he was like ahead of him in position. And he's been, I know it was that's him. That's that Jew.
That's Colonel Sanders. He makes chicken.
Well, he went on to make some very tasty chicken. Of course, he changed his name by that point. But so he was. I remember. I know it was Darryl Cooper who did this amazing podcast series. It's basically a book on tape, but it's like the best, man. It's like 30 hours long or something like that. But if you really want to understand like the history of the conflict, it's the best thing to listen to. It's just brilliant guy. But he said that he calls him the last humanist Zionist. But so Chaim Weizmann's whole theory was that like, look, if this is going to work, there's only one way it's going to work, which is that we have to like just smother these Arabs with kindness. And we got to bring all this investment in and make their lives so much better than their lives were before we got here. And that's the only way that we're actually going to have like a meaningful, sustainable homeland where we're not at war with our neighbors. And this was swallowed by the Zionists for a while. And it was really after World War II when like Ben Gurion and all these other guys, Menachem Begin and these guys were like, no, you're living in like you could almost hear it from an American perspective. They'd go, you're living in a pre-Holocaust world. Like is it the same way they'd say pre-9/11 world? Like it was almost like, yeah. That was all nice and good before. But like these guys just tried to exterminate us. So now we're gonna take what's ours and we're gonna do it by any means necessary. If we got to embrace terrorism to kick the British out. And you could see, you're talking like 1946, 1947. Well, look, America just dropped 2 nukes on Japanese cities. We just burned Germany to the ground. Who the hell? And they just got Holocausted. Who the hell is anyone to tell us that we're not allowed to break a few eggs in order to make what we want to make? So, and by the way, like as a Jewish person, like I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that mentality. But at the same time, you could also go from the perspective of Palestinian Arabs. You're like, hey, we didn't do that. Yeah. Like that wasn't us. Like we're like, why are we paying the price for what like some Europeans did to you? Like, hey, carve up a part of Germany and give it to them if that's what happened. Like, why are we the ones?
These people didn't try to exterminate us. Those people tried to exterminate us.
Right. So there's, it's just like the tragedy of history. like on every sitcom ever where they would like tease the couple that's supposed to get together. Like this was our childhood was always like, Ross and Rachel, they're about to get together and then, she got the wrong message. And now now it's 2 more years until they get, it's always like, you guys were right here and just to make this work. And so I just think the whole thing could have gone a lot better. But for us to be a country thousands of miles away, to not be like, listen, if your family member was killed on October 7th, I'm not going to sit there and talk to someone and be like, you really shouldn't be leveling Gaza right now. Because I know if my family was killed on that, I think especially like you got a kid now, man. It's like when you have kids, you kind of like, you understand a different level of that. I mean, you could always understand like your friend or like your parents or something like that. But you're like, I got 2 little kids. You're like, dude, if someone hurt one of my kids, just the levels of evil that I could sing to, it's really not very hard for me to get there. Like as soon as I start thinking about it, I'm like, kill anything that moves. Yeah. Kill anything. And so I totally understand that.
Makes you understand human behavior way better.
But this was
the worst versions of it.
So, what originally woke me up, got me really interested in politics was Ron